to give us answers. But what if they can't? For these unlucky patients, diagnosis is a mystery. In 1994, high school sweethearts Angela and John Wolfe are elated at the birth of their first daughter, Ashley.
She was chubby, extremely chubby, very healthy, happy.
Just always soothed, never really had any issues.
There's something special about the first grandchild. She's just a great baby, happy, great personality.
Baby Ashley seems to be doing fine, except for a particularly nasty case of diarrhea.
Being your first child, you never really know what to expect. I thought maybe it is normal.
I started questioning it after a couple months, and I was told that the stool would firm up after I completed nursing.
But even after Ashley begins eating solid baby food, her diarrhea persists.
She was having 8 to 12 bowel movements a day.
A pediatrician was not really ready to investigate it to a thorough degree, was sort of at a wait-and-see type of mentality. Let her grow out of it, see how she does.
But as the years pass, Ashley does not grow out of it. In fact, she begins to develop other strange behaviors.
By 5, I knew something wasn't right, for sure. She was too thin. She was eating enormous amounts of food.
I think when I really noticed anything abnormal, it was her diet and her eating habits. She was a voracious eater.
I had no idea what was going on. I just knew something's not right.
Angie and John's concerns about Ashley are confirmed after the birth of their younger son, who does not show any of Ashley's symptoms. The revelation is bittersweet. While they celebrate the family's new and healthy addition, their anxiety over their daughter is growing by the day. Ultimately, they decide to make an appointment with a pediatric gastroenterologist.
I took her in, gave him the entire background. I even explained a situation where she had eaten watermelon, and very soon after she ate the watermelon, 3 to 4 hours, I believe, I found seeds in her stool. And he told me that that just wasn't possible, and I was exaggerating. I felt as if he was calling me a liar. He absolutely didn't believe me. He even giggled at me.
Frustrated, the Wolfes do the best they can to manage Ashley's gastrointestinal problems. Then, later that year, they receive more disturbing news from Ashley's first-grade teacher.
She called and said she believed my daughter had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and that we should consider medicating her. I said, I completely disagree. I spend more time with her, and I don't believe that's the case. So I ended up saying, maybe it's that your class is too boring for her.
Despite the regular diarrhea and weight issue, Ashley's condition is stable for the next several months. Until one night, during a family visit with Angela's parents, something terrifying happens.
She woke up in the middle of the night, screaming in pain and feeling like she was going to vomit.
She was screaming and crying that her tummy hurt.
Just, crying and scared and not knowing what's going on.
The first thing popped in my head was appendicitis, but we really didn't know.
They rush Ashley to the local ER, where the doctor on call performs a thorough exam.
They said it's not her appendix, it's nothing serious, take her home. So I took her back home. A couple hours later, she was screaming in pain again. So I took her back to the emergency room. The doctor decided to take an x-ray. And he said, I'm not sure, but the film is not quite clear, but it's possible she has some kind of blockage in her intestine. Take her back home, and if needed, if it doesn't subside, bring her back again. So I did.
But several hours later, Ashley is still writhing in pain. She refuses to drink any fluids and is getting weaker by the minute.
We're back at the emergency room again a couple hours later. The doctor, he said, I don't see any problem, but she's starting to get dehydrated. You need to make sure she drinks, or we're going to have to do an IV. I said, why don't you just do the IV, because she won't drink. Well, I don't think that's necessary, so why don't you take her back home?
I was totally stunned. I could not believe it.
By morning, Ashley is extremely weak and pale. Now desperate for help, the Wolfs hurry their daughter to the pediatrician for an emergency appointment.
Ashley was so ill she couldn't even walk. I had to carry her from the house to the car, from the car into the doctor's office.
The pediatrician is as alarmed as Ashley's parents.
He looked at her, one look, and said, "Take her to the hospital now."
After a grueling night driving back and forth from the ER, Ashley is finally admitted to the hospital, where she's immediately given IV fluids for dehydration.
I was scared to death. I didn't know what was going on.
She was extremely dehydrated, lethargic, wouldn't move, wouldn't talk.
I'd never seen her sick ever like this before.
But after she got some IV fluids, she was doing better. And I thought to myself, this must be related to the diarrhea. It has to be.
After 36 hours on the IV, Ashley recovers from her dehydration and she's discharged. But Angela refuses to leave without answers. It's then that she decides to try a different tactic.
I collected some of her stool in a clear container.
And when the doctor came in, she walked up to him and stuck it right in his face and said, does this look normal to you?
This is what I deal with 8 to 12 times a day. This is not normal. I need some answers, and I need them now.
A light bulb went off with him, and he was finally wanting to listen and hear what we had to say.
Believing they are now finally in good hands, the Wolfs begin to see the new gastrointestinal specialist regularly. After a few weeks of stool testing, he tells them their daughter has irritable bowel syndrome, a catch-all diagnosis for abdominal pain and changes in bowel habits.
He prescribed anti-diarrhea medication, and it slowed her down to maybe 3 to 5 stools a day for a while. But over time, maybe a couple months, she was back to 8 to 12 a day. I would call him, and he would say, just bump her dosage up a little bit. So we did, and it would slow her down a little bit. And the same scenario kept repeating itself. So I called him, and I said, the loperamide's not working. She's built up a tolerance. We're right back where we were. She's still eating incredible amounts of food. She's having trouble in school now. She's very skinny. Irritable bowel is such a generic label. I need you to tell me what this is.
As Ashley's mysterious condition hangs over the Wolf family, the situation begins to take a toll on Angela and John, who for the first time in 19 years find themselves growing apart.
He didn't want to talk about it. I had to talk about it. He just shut down.
My number one goal at that point was to find out what I could do to help Ashley. And that's how I focused my energy.
Pretty soon they started pushing away from each other. John would go on one side of the house and Angie in the other, and of course, everything was the other person's fault.
She was very upset, and I understood that too, and I was upset as well. I mean, Ashley's been suffering for many years with this.
Then in 2001, now 8 years old and living with a constant state of diarrhea, Ashley's parents notice something else.
I noticed Ashley holding books quite a bit closer. I thought that just can't be. 6 or 7 months previous, I had her eyes fully examined. She had 20/20 vision. Then a couple nights later, we were playing a board game where you had to read some cards, and she could not read the writing on the cards. And I realized she can't see.
Nine-year-old Ashley Wolf has had diarrhea her whole life, and doctors can't figure out why. Now her mother Angela notices that Ashley is having trouble seeing as well. Angela takes Ashley to a local optometrist who observes something odd in Ashley's lenses. He immediately refers Angela to pediatric ophthalmologist Charles Bach.
We did a complete eye examination, and at that time we found that Ashley's best corrected vision was 2100, which is about 5 times worse than a normal person would see. The rest of the examination included dilating her eyes, looking at the lenses of the eyes, and that's when I first saw the cataracts.
And I was very shocked and surprised. I mean, how could a 10-year-old have cataracts? That's just virtually impossible.
Mostly seen in older people, cataracts are a clouding over of the lens, brought on by changes in the proteins of the eye. When the lens is cloudy, vision becomes blurred. And depending on how severe the cataracts are, corrective surgery may be required.
When I first saw the cataracts, I was struck by how unusual her cataracts looked. It was almost as if there was a snowstorm inside of the lens of her eye, with a very dense area of opacity in the back of the lens, which meant that she could barely see anything through her lenses. Cataracts in this age group are really uncommon unless they're due to trauma. It was clear that I didn't know everything about Ashley that I needed to know, and so I asked Angie a few more questions. I asked her, is there anything about Ashley's history that you have thought of while I was examining her that I should know about?
And I started going into her history in detail, the trouble in school, her eating, her diarrhea.
I said, tell me more. And she said, well, she's had diarrhea since birth.
He kept looking at the cataracts very closely. And he says, these look metabolic in nature to me, and I don't want to operate until we know what's going on.
Metabolic refers to anything having to do with your body's metabolism, how you absorb nutrients, how you process nutrients, the enzymes in your body that are responsible for carrying out any biochemical process. And at that point, I suggested that she really needed to see a metabolic geneticist.
John was with me. I said, take the kids to the car. So he took the kids to the car. I called my dad.
There was terror in Angie's voice. I basically told her she had to hold it together. Don't break down in front of Ashley.
I didn't want Ashley to see me because I didn't want to scare her. But right then, my gut told me something bad is going on.
Dr. Bach refers the Wolfs to genetic specialist Dr. George Anadiotis.
I was suspicious because of this history of diarrhea and this history of cataracts. And so off the top of my head, I couldn't think of a link between why an individual would have cataracts, involvement of the ocular system, and diarrhea, involvement of the GI system. And then there were concerns regarding her learning, so I was concerned that her neurologic system was affected. Anybody can have a problem with one organ system, but when you start having multiple organ systems affected, then the odds of these kind of things just all happening at random decrease dramatically. So the fact that she had 3 different organ systems affected make me think that this is most likely a genetic or metabolic issue, and that these things were somehow linked together.
After a thorough examination, the Wolfs are sent home. But Dr. Anadiotis assures them that he's on the case.
Dr. Anadiotis' office called 2 days later and said, we think we might have an idea of what we're looking at here. Could you bring Ashley in for some blood work? I asked her what they were looking for, and she didn't want to tell me. She said, you'll just get on the internet and scare yourself to death. So I'm not going to tell you until we're certain what's going on.
5 days later, Angela takes Ashley to Dr. Anadiotis' office for the blood tests, which he will send to a special lab. But unbeknownst to Dr. Anadiotis, while Ashley is having her blood drawn, Angela seizes an opportunity.
The nurse had stepped out of the room. I saw the paperwork sitting there. So I walked over to the paperwork, realized there was a photocopier right there, copied the first couple pages, and then put the paperwork back and took the information home with me. I called John on the phone. I told him exactly what I did. I said I made copies of the paperwork because no one would tell me what it was. I looked it up online, and it's bad. It's really bad.
Angela and John Wolf are terrified. They are awaiting test results which will tell them if their 10-year-old daughter, Ashley, has a devastating illness that could, among other things, severely impair her brain functions. The wait is grueling.
I think it took 4 or 6 weeks. And every day I'd have moments where I'd just break down. I hate this part.
Even though they don't yet know Ashley's exact diagnosis, with the little bits of information they've managed to get, Angela and John spend the next 4 frantic weeks researching the possibilities online.
You read what happens over time, and you think, my child's gonna go from this beautiful, normal kid to eventually immobile, mentally retarded, with a feeding tube in a nursing home. I can't let that happen. That can't happen.
Finally, after the grueling wait, the Wolfs get word that the test results are back.
I brought the family back in to talk to them at length about what's going on. And so we said, the results are positive. Ashley has what's known as Cerebrotendinous Xanthomatosis.
Affecting 1 in 50,000 people in the U.S., CTX is a congenital metabolic disorder. Those afflicted with CTX lack the enzyme that the body needs to break down cholesterol. Cholesterol, in turn, builds up in various parts of the body, gradually interfering with normal system functions. This often results in diarrhea and early-onset cataracts, although physicians don't know why.
A lot of individuals present with these 2 findings as a common presentation. It's just that the link between the two isn't really a well-understood concept among the general physician population.
But fortunately for Ashley, she's diagnosed early in her life.
A lot of individuals who are older often may fall into the mild mental retardation category. They can also have risks for heart disease as well.
Dr. Xanthomatosis informs Angela and John that CTX is genetic, which means they are both carriers of the gene.
When you have 2 parents who are carriers, there's always a chance of having an affected child. So if you want to think of it as you have one, so to speak, normal gene, and you have one abnormal gene. Each parent has a 50-50 chance of passing on either the normal gene or the abnormal one. If both parents pass on the abnormal one to the child, you're going to have an affected individual, okay? But the parents themselves are completely normal.
It is a bittersweet moment for the Wolfs.
So when she finally gets a diagnosis and we finally know what she has, it's a huge relief.
I felt good. I also felt terrible because I knew that my daughter had a disorder that she's going to have to deal with for the rest of her life.
The course of treatment for patients with CTX is an obscure but easily producible drug known as CDCA, or chenodeoxycholic acid.
What it does is it replaces a component in her chemical makeup that's missing due to the mutation of the gene that causes CTX. In a normal person, they produce this type of acid and their metabolism is fine. In Ashley's case, she just simply is missing it.
However, while CDCA was heavily used in the 70s to treat gallstones, it has since been discontinued in the United States.
So chenodeoxycholic acid is made by the pharmaceutical industry for like industrial purposes, like in tons, but there's so few individuals with these kind of problems. There's not a pharmaceutical company out there that's interested in taking that huge volume and putting it in capsules.
We were very, very scared because we knew the effects of this disorder without the medication were severe and the progression was rapid, and she would end up in a bed, fed by a tube, a shell of a human.
But after a frantic search, the Wolfs finally managed to locate a source for CDCA overseas.
We were getting it from a company in Germany. We could only import 3 months of it at a time. I've thought about going over to Europe with Ashley and filling our suitcases with boxes and boxes of it before they run out.
As Ashley begins treatment, she slowly begins to improve.
Within the first month, her diarrhea had completely cleared up. After several months, she was doing better in school. She started gaining weight right away.
4 months later, Ashley's cataracts are surgically removed, and she has 20/20 vision.
Looking back over her history, I don't think anyone could have guessed, just from the diarrhea, that this is what Ashley has.
That's what happens in genetics, is that things are so rare that sometimes I see it and I won't see it again in another 20 years of practice. And we have a saying in medicine is that when you hear hoofbeats, you think horses, not zebras. But in genetics, the horses are all extinct. The world is populated by zebras.
Today, 13-year-old Ashley leads a normal life and is learning to understand her important role in raising awareness for her rare disease.
I feel kind of like a stronger person. It makes me feel like I can teach more people so that they can like figure out if they have it so they don't get worse and worse like I was before I was diagnosed.
And Angie and John have found renewed strength as well.
I think that our relationship has drastically improved. You know, Ashley was the glue that held us together.
What do you tell a child that asks why me? I said, I think part of the reason is you're strong enough to handle it when some other children aren't. You were built to handle it.
Fortunately for the Wolf family, Ashley's diagnosis would come early in her young life. But for 25-year-old